The summer sun beat down mercilessly on the small church in Timber Creek, Colorado, as Elizabeth Montgomery stood frozen in her wedding dress, the delicate lace veil doing little to hide the shock and humiliation etched across her face. The whispers rippled through the assembled guests like wind through prairie grass, as the minutes ticked by with no sign of her betrothed, Thomas Claiborne, son of the wealthiest cattle baron in the territory. Sheriff Mills approached her father with a telegram in hand, and the older man's face fell as he read the yellow paper. "He ain't coming, Lizzie," her father said softly, the words falling between them like stones. "Says he's found another, a banker's daughter from Denver." The church fell silent as Elizabeth's white-gloved hands began to tremble, the carefully arranged wildflowers in her bouquet scattering to the floor like broken promises. Hey friends, thanks for joining me today for another tale of the Old West. If you're enjoying these stories, please subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments what city you're watching from. 3 days later, Elizabeth found herself atop the stagecoach heading northwest into the mountains. Her wedding dress sold for travel money, and her few possessions packed in a single trunk. Her uncle owned a trading post in the mining settlement of Silvercrest, and she had nowhere else to go, not after the public humiliation that made her the subject of pitying glances and cruel gossip in Timber Creek. The other passengers eyed her curiously, but kept their distance, as though heartbreak might be contagious. As the stagecoach climbed higher into the rugged terrain, Elizabeth pressed her forehead against the window glass, watching the familiar world disappear behind her. The mountains loomed ahead, jagged and unforgiving, much like the future she now faced, unmarried at 24, with no prospects and a reputation stained by abandonment. The stagecoach never made it to Silvercrest. 10 miles short of the settlement, the right front wheel struck a boulder and splintered, sending the coach lurching dangerously close to the edge of the narrow mountain pass. "Everyone out!" the driver shouted, his voice tight with urgency. "She's gonna tip!" Elizabeth and the other passengers scrambled from the crippled vehicle, retrieving what belongings they could before the coach groaned and slid several feet toward the precipice. The driver assessed the damage with a grim expression. "Can't fix this here. I'll have to walk to Silvercrest and bring back help." He tipped his hat apologetically. "Should be back by morning, folks. Best make camp for the night." As darkness fell and temperatures dropped in the high mountain air, Elizabeth huddled beneath her woolen shawl, her city clothes proving woefully inadequate for the mountain night. It was just before dawn when the mountain man found them. Elizabeth awoke to the sound of hoofbeats and the sight of a massive figure on horseback, emerging from the mist like an apparition. He dismounted with surprising grace for a man of his size, moving toward the driver who had kept watch through the night. In the growing light, Elizabeth could see him clearly now, tall and broad-shouldered, with a thick dark beard and eyes the color of a winter sky. A Winchester rifle was strapped to his saddle, and a Colt revolver hung at his hip. The stranger spoke briefly with the driver, his voice a low rumble that didn't carry to where she sat. The driver pointed to the breaking coach and then to the passengers, explaining their predicament. The mountain man nodded once and turned to address the stranded travelers. "Name's Ethan Blackwood," he said, his voice gruff from disuse. "Got a cabin 3 miles up the trail. Room enough for the women and older folk. The rest can wait here for help from town." His gaze swept over them, assessing, until it landed on Elizabeth. Something flickered in those cold blue eyes, perhaps surprise at finding a young woman alone among the travelers, before he looked away. The driver seemed to know the man and nodded in agreement. "Blackwood's good people, despite appearances," he assured them. "Any who want to go with him will be safer than out here with night coming again." 4 passengers elected to remain with the coach, but Elizabeth and an elderly couple accepted the mountain man's offer. As she gathered her trunk, Ethan Blackwood approached her silently and lifted it as though it weighed nothing, securing it to his horse before offering his hand to help her onto the steed. The cabin perched on a ridge overlooking a valley where mist clung to the pines like spectral fingers. It was larger than Elizabeth had expected, built of solid logs with a stone chimney that promised warmth. A corral stood nearby with 3 horses that whickered at their approach. Inside, the cabin was unexpectedly orderly, a far cry from the wilderness hovel Elizabeth had imagined. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, while bookshelves lined another, filled with leather-bound volumes that seemed incongruous with the rough-hewn man who owned them. "You and the Millers can take the back room," Ethan said, indicating the elderly couple who had accompanied them. "I'll sleep out here." He moved with quiet efficiency, stoking the fire and setting a pot of coffee to boil before stepping back outside to tend to his horse. "Never thought I'd see Blackwood take in strangers," Mrs. Miller whispered to Elizabeth as they settled into the small but clean bedroom. "Folks in Silvercrest say he hasn't spoken more than 10 words together to anyone in years." Her husband nodded in agreement. "Used to be a doctor back east, rumor has it. Something happened during the war, something bad. Came out here to disappear." Elizabeth glanced out the window where she could see Ethan chopping wood with powerful, rhythmic strokes that spoke of years of solitary labor. A doctor turned mountain hermit. What tragedy had driven him to such isolation? She thought of her own retreat from society and felt a strange kinship with the brooding stranger who had offered them shelter. That evening, as the Millers dozed by the fire, Elizabeth found the courage to approach their taciturn host. "Thank you for your hospitality, Mr. Blackwood," she said softly, standing at the edge of the kitchen where he was preparing a simple stew. He glanced up, seemingly startled to be addressed directly. "Just Ethan," he corrected, turning his attention back to the pot. "And it's nothing. Couldn't leave folks to freeze." Elizabeth watched his hands, large and calloused, but moving with a precision that hinted at his rumored medical background. "You were a doctor once?" she asked, remembering Mrs. Miller's words. His shoulders stiffened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. "Once," he finally said, the single word carrying the weight of 1,000 untold stories. Morning brought clear skies and the arrival of a wagon from Silvercrest to collect the stranded passengers. Elizabeth stood on the porch of the cabin, watching as the Millers thanked Ethan and climbed aboard. Her uncle's trading post awaited her, yet something made her hesitate. "Coming this?" the driver called, but before she could answer, Ethan stepped forward. "Miss Montgomery has agreed to stay on as my housekeeper for a spell," he said, his deep voice betraying no emotion. "Her uncle knows where to find her." Elizabeth turned to him in surprise. They had exchanged no such agreement, but something in his expression silenced her question. The driver shrugged, unconcerned with the arrangement, and with a crack of his whip, the wagon rolled away, leaving Elizabeth alone with the mountain man and the unspoken understanding that had passed between them. "I have no need of a housekeeper," Ethan said once the wagon had disappeared down the trail. "But I reckon you have need of time away from prying eyes and wagging tongues." Elizabeth felt heat rise to her cheeks. How did he know? "Your wedding ring finger is pale but empty," he explained, noting her confusion. "And no woman travels alone to these mountains unless she's running from something or someone." His perception unsettled her, but his offer of sanctuary touched something deep within. "I can cook and clean," she offered. "Earn my keep until I decide what's next." He nodded once, as though the matter were settled, and pointed toward a small shed beside the cabin. "Got furs to be dressed and meat to be smoked. Know anything about that?" She shook her head. "I'm a quick learner," she replied, lifting her chin with a determination that, for the first time since being abandoned at the altar, felt genuine. The days fell into a rhythm as autumn painted the mountains in fiery hues. Elizabeth learned to dress furs, smoke meat, and tend the vegetable garden that supplied Ethan's table. He left each morning with his rifle and returned with game or fish, speaking little but watching her with an intensity that made her skin warm despite the cooling weather. At night, he read by lamplight from his extensive library while she mended clothes or prepared food for the coming days. Occasionally, he would read aloud passages from Emerson or Thoreau that spoke of solitude and nature's wisdom, in a voice that grew less gruff with use. She learned he had indeed been a surgeon in Philadelphia before the war, though he never spoke of what had driven him to the mountains. In turn, she told him of Thomas's betrayal, surprised by how the pain of it had dulled in the thin mountain air and simple routine of their days. October brought the first dusting of snow and a letter from her uncle, delivered by a passing trapper who stopped for supplies. Elizabeth read it by the fire, aware of Ethan's eyes upon her. "My uncle worries," she explained. "Wants me to come to Silvercrest before winter closes the passes." Something like disappointment flickered across Ethan's normally impassive face, so quickly she might have imagined it. "The mountains are no place for a city woman in winter," he agreed, though his tone lacked conviction. That night, as wind howled outside and embers glowed in the fireplace, Elizabeth made her decision. "I'd like to stay," she said simply, "if you'll have me." Ethan looked up from his book, his blue eyes reflecting the firelight. "Why?" he asked, the single word carrying the weight of his isolation and her unexpected intrusion upon it. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "Because for the first time since I can remember, I'm not playing a part written by someone else." Winter descended with a vengeance, blanketing the ridge in deep snow that transformed the landscape into a pristine wilderness of white. The cabin became their entire world, warm and snug against the howling blizzards that sometimes raged for days. Elizabeth found herself watching Ethan as he moved about their shared space, noting how the hardness in his eyes had softened and how his beard sometimes hid the beginnings of a smile. One evening, as they sat by the fire, drinking coffee laced with whiskey to ward off the cold, she asked the question that had lingered between them. "What happened during the war, Ethan?" For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "I was at Antietam," he finally said, his voice low. "Worst day of the war. 3,000 men died in a single day, and I couldn't save them all. Couldn't save most." His words hung in the firelit cabin as he continued, the story spilling from him like long-dammed water breaking free. "There was a boy, no more than 17, Kentucky farm boy. His leg was shattered, beyond saving. I took it off while he screamed for his mother." Ethan's hands, always so steady, trembled slightly as he set down his cup. "He died anyway, blood poisoning. And when I wrote to tell his family, I learned he was the last son. 3 brothers already lost at Shiloh and Bull Run." He fell silent, lost in memories Elizabeth could only imagine. "After that, I couldn't do it anymore. Couldn't face another mother's son dying under my hands. So I came here, where the only blood I'd have to see was from game I'd hunted clean. The confession seemed to exhaust him, and Elizabeth reached across the space between them to take his hand, a gesture so natural it surprised them both. As January's grip tightened around the mountain, Elizabeth fell ill with a fever that left her weak and shivering, despite the roaring fire and extra blankets. Ethan's medical training emerged fully as he tended to her day and night, brewing willow bark tea for the fever and bathing her brow with cool cloths when she burned hottest. In her delirium, she spoke of Thomas and the wedding that never was, of her father's disappointment and her own shattered dreams. "I'm glad he left me," she whispered, her eyes bright with fever as she clutched Ethan's hand. "If he hadn't, I never would have found you." Ethan froze, uncertainty written across his features, as he brushed damp hair from her forehead. "Rest, Elizabeth," he murmured, his voice gentler than she had ever heard it. "Just rest." When the fever broke 3 days later, neither mentioned her feverish confession, though something had shifted between them, a current of unspoken feeling that charged the air of the small cabin. February brought clearer skies and a trapper who stopped for supplies, bringing news from Silvercrest and beyond. Thomas Claiborne, Elizabeth's former fiancé, had married his Denver banker's daughter, only to discover her family was deeply in debt. The cattle baron's son was now working in his father-in-law's bank to repay creditors. The news should have satisfied Elizabeth, perhaps even pleased her, but she felt nothing beyond a distant pity for the man who had once held her heart. That night, as she prepared their supper, she felt Ethan's presence behind her, closer than he usually stood. "Would you go back?" he asked, his voice uncertain. If the passes were clear and the stage was running? Elizabeth turned to face him, suddenly aware of how small the kitchen was and how large Ethan seemed within it. "No," she answered truthfully. "There's nothing for me there now." His eyes searched hers for a moment before he nodded, as though confirming something to himself, and moved away. But later, as she lay in her small bed, listening to the wind in the pines, she heard him pacing the main room, restless as a caged wolf. The first signs of spring came in late March, a subtle warming in the air and the drip of melting snow from the cabin's eaves. Elizabeth was hanging laundry on a line strung between 2 pines when she heard the approach of horses. 3 riders appeared on the trail leading to the cabin, and she recognized her uncle among them. Ethan emerged from the woodshed, rifle in hand, his posture tense until he identified the visitors. James Montgomery dismounted with the stiffness of an aging man and approached his niece with open arms. "Lizzie, thank God," he said, embracing her. "We feared you lost in the winter storms." Over her uncle's shoulder, Elizabeth saw Ethan watching them, his face unreadable as he leaned his rifle against the cabin wall. "I'm well, Uncle James," she assured him, stepping back. "Mr. Blackwood has been most kind." Her uncle glanced at the mountain man with open curiosity. "I've brought news, Lizzie," he said, turning back to her. "Your father is ill, asking for you." The words fell between them like stones. "Nothing grave," he hastened to add, seeing her expression, "but he wishes to make amends before age takes him further." One of the riders cleared his throat. "Stage leaves tomorrow at noon, Miss Montgomery. Last seat's yours if you want it." Elizabeth looked toward Ethan, who had moved to tend the horses, his broad back deliberately turned to the conversation. "I need to speak with Mr. Blackwood," she said finally. "Alone." Her uncle nodded, though his expression showed concern. "We'll make camp down by the stream," he said. "Give you time to gather your things." As the men moved away, Elizabeth approached Ethan where he stood with the horses, his hands mechanically checking cinches that needed no attention. "I have to go to my father," she said simply when she reached his side. Ethan nodded without looking at her. "Man needs his daughter at such times," he agreed, his voice carefully neutral. Elizabeth waited for more, but he offered nothing. No plea for her to return. No declaration of feelings that might have grown during their winter isolation. Frustration bubbled within her. "Is that all you have to say?" she demanded. Ethan finally turned to her, his blue eyes troubled. "What would you have me say, Elizabeth? That these mountains will seem emptier without you? That I've grown accustomed to your voice, filling spaces that have been silent for years?" He ran a hand through his beard, a gesture she had come to recognize as discomfort. "I'm not a man of fancy words or promises. I'm just a man who found peace in solitude until you came along and made solitude seem like less of a blessing." The admission, halting though it was, unlocked something in Elizabeth's chest. "Ask me to come back," she whispered, stepping closer to him. Ethan's eyes widened slightly, a vulnerability in them she had rarely seen. "You have a life waiting in Timber Creek," he said, though he didn't move away from her. "A proper life among proper folks, not a mountain cabin with a man the war broke." Elizabeth shook her head, reaching up to touch his bearded cheek with a gentle hand. "I was broken too," she reminded him. "Left standing in a church, in a white dress, with nothing but humiliation for company. You gave me shelter when I needed it most. Not just from the winter, but from what they all must have been saying." Ethan's hand covered hers, rough and warm against her skin. "Come back if you can," he said finally, the words seeming to cost him greatly. "I'll be here." The journey to Timber Creek took 4 days. 4 days in which Elizabeth had ample time to consider the strange turn her life had taken. From abandoned bride to mountain woman. From a future as a cattle baron's wife to what? The uncertainty should have frightened her, but instead, she found herself impatient with each delay, eager to see her father and then return to the mountains where Ethan waited. Her father, gray and diminished in his sickbed, but still sharp of mind, wept when she entered his bedroom. "Thought that fool Claiborne had stolen my chance to make things right," he said, squeezing her hand with surprising strength. "I should have stood by you more, Lizzie. Should have called him out for the coward he was." Elizabeth forgave him easily, her heart lighter than it had been in months. She stayed 2 weeks, nursing him back to health and setting his affairs in order, all while fending off curious questions about her time in the mountains. Thomas Claiborne appeared at her father's house on the eve of her planned departure, his once immaculate appearance somewhat faded, his cocksure manners subdued. "Heard you were back," he said, hat in hand on the front porch. "Thought we might speak." Elizabeth regarded him coolly, noting how small he seemed now compared to her memory, and how very small compared to Ethan Blackwood. "There's nothing to say, Thomas," she replied. "What's done is done." He shuffled his feet, embarrassment coloring his cheeks. "My situation has changed," he admitted. "Marriage isn't what I expected. Perhaps we could—" Elizabeth cut him off with a raised hand. "I'm promised elsewhere," she said, the words feeling right as they left her lips, "to a man who would never leave me standing alone in a church." Thomas's face registered shock, then a flash of the old arrogance. "Some miner or trapper from the mountains?" he scoffed. "Hardly a suitable match for a Montgomery." Elizabeth smiled, thinking of Ethan's library and the gentle way his surgeon's hands had tended her fever. "On the contrary," she replied, "he's the most suitable man I've ever known." The stagecoach labored up the mountain pass, Elizabeth's heart quickening as familiar landmarks appeared through the window. When they reached the spot where the coach had broken down last summer, where her new life had begun, she asked the driver to stop. "My destination is nearby," she explained, retrieving her trunk. The driver looked skeptical. "Nothing out here but Blackwood's place, miss." Elizabeth smiled. "Exactly." Understanding dawned on the man's weathered face. "Well, I'll be," he muttered, helping her down. Blackwood finally found himself a woman brave enough to take him on. She thanked him and began walking the familiar trail, her trunk left to be collected later. She wanted nothing between her and the cabin that had become more home to her than any place she had ever known. Ethan was splitting wood in the yard when she crested the final rise, his axe rising and falling in the same powerful rhythm she remembered. He paused mid-swing as though sensing her presence, turning slowly to watch her approach. For a moment, neither spoke. Elizabeth, taking in the sight of him, somehow more handsome than her memory had painted, and Ethan staring at her as though she might be a mirage conjured by mountain loneliness. "You came back," he finally said, driving the axe into the chopping block and taking a step toward her. Elizabeth closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching him. "I promised I would," she reminded him. Ethan's eyes searched hers, caution and hope warring in their blue depths. "For how long?" he asked, the question barely above a whisper. Elizabeth smiled up at him, reaching for his hand, with a certainty that banished all her previous doubts. "For as long as you'll have me, Dr. Blackwood," she answered, "which I hope might be forever." The mountain air carried the scent of pine and wood smoke as Ethan pulled her to him, his arms enfolding her with a gentleness that belied their strength. "The cabin's too small," he murmured against her hair. "The winter's too harsh. The nearest neighbor miles away." Elizabeth leaned back to look into his face, her heart full at the worry she saw there. Worry for her comfort, not his solitude. "Then we'll build a bigger cabin," she said simply. "Plant more for the winter, and I have all the company I need right here." Ethan's smile transformed his face, erasing years of isolation and grief, as he lowered his lips to hers in a kiss that promised warmth through all the mountain winters to come. Later, as twilight settled over the ridge and they sat together on the porch, watching stars appear above the pines, Elizabeth knew with absolute certainty that Thomas Claiborne had given her the greatest gift possible when he left her at that altar: the freedom to find her true home in the arms of a mountain man who had healed her heart even as she had healed his solitude. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left.